Victoria Carrington called the police the morning she found me standing at the edge of the lake as if a black man in fed work clothes could never belong in a place like Silver Pines. She pointed at me while she spoke to the officers and told them I was trespassing on private community property. I did not argue with her. I asked one question instead. Had anyone bothered to check the land records? Victoria laughed and told me I should walk away before I ended up in handcuffs. Then the laugh dried up in her throat because the officer read the name printed on the deed. It was mine. If satisfying stories like this one are your kind of thing, subscribe to the channel and stay with me until the very last line. My name is Darius Holloway. I am 47 years old and I have spent more than half my life moving dirt for a living. I own a small grading and drainage company with 9 employees, 2 excavators, a skid steer that should have been retired years ago, and a reputation built entirely on the fact that water goes where I tell it to go. I drive a Ford F-150 that turned over 200,000 miles last spring, and I have no plans to replace it because the seat has finally molded to my back. My clothes are work pants, steel toe boots, and a canvas shirt that used to be navy blue before 11 summers bleached it gray. Nobody looks at me and thinks about money, which has always suited me. What I own quietly, and that habit is exactly why this whole story happened the way it did. 3 years before that morning, I bought a parcel that the county records call the Holloway Tract, though it carried an older family name before my signature went on it. 38.2 acres of scrub oak, sloping meadow, an abandoned pump house, and a graded service road that had gone soft in the middle from 20 years of neglect. I bought it because the drainage was interesting to me and because the price was low for reasons that had more to do with paperwork than with land. The seller was an estate, the heirs lived 4 states away, and none of them had ever walked the property line. My title company earned every dollar of their fee on that closing, and the attorney who reviewed the file for me told me twice in the same phone call that I should read the legal description slowly. So I did, twice at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside my elbow. The legal description did something that surprised even me. My property line did not stop at the tree line, and it did not stop at the shoulder of the old service road. It ran straight down the slope and continued into the water, taking in the lakebed itself, a maintenance strip along the shoreline, and the full width of that engineered access road. The lake had a name on the plat that everybody in the area used without thinking about it: Lake Bellweather. Before there was a single rooftop in Silver Pines Estates, before the entry monument and the wrought iron fencing and the annual dues, that water was a private irrigation reservoir dug on a working farm. The farm sold off its outer acreage. The core parcel, the one holding most of the water, never left the family. Then the estate sold it to me. The developers who built Silver Pines needed the lake for their brochures because a subdivision with a lake sells for considerably more than a subdivision with a retention pond. What they could not get was ownership. So more than 2 decades ago, their attorneys and the farm's attorneys sat down and produced an easement, recorded and stamped and filed away, granting residents of the future community the right to walk the shoreline path, launch small boats, fish from the bank, and use a single dock at an agreed location. An easement is permission with edges on it. It is not a transfer of title, and it never becomes one just because time passes and everybody forgets to reread the document. I knew all of this the day I closed. I told exactly nobody because I had no reason to and no interest in the conversation. Then we got 11 inches of rain in 9 days, and the water came up higher than I had ever seen it. On the second dry morning, I drove out early to look at the outlet structure in the toe of the eastern bank, because that is where erosion always shows itself first. I parked on the flat spot near the old pump house, pulled my boots up, and walked down the slope with a spade in one hand. Before I got 20 feet, I stopped walking because the shoreline did not look the way it had looked in March. Somebody had trucked in rock, a lot of rock. Fresh crushed stone had been dumped along a 50-foot stretch of bank and packed into place with a machine, and the tracks in the softened ground were still crisp enough to read. Above the rock stood a new retaining wall, built out of tan segmental block, roughly 3 courses high and running long enough to matter. 50 feet farther down, the dock had grown, not repaired, grown. There was new framing, new decking, a wider platform at the far end, and a pair of galvanized posts sunk into the lake bed that had absolutely not been there the last time I checked. None of it was ugly work. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. That was almost the problem, because sloppy work gets torn out and careful work gets defended. I stood there with the spade in my hand, doing arithmetic in my head, and the arithmetic kept coming out the same way. I went back to the truck for the survey I keep in a plastic file box behind the seat, the one with a rubber band around it and coffee rings on the cover sheet. My boundary is not a mystery out there because the original surveyor set iron pins and the estate's old crew had marked them with lengths of steel rebar and orange caps. I found the pin near the pump house in about 4 minutes. I found the second one down the slope with a little more digging because the storm had washed silt over the top of it. Then I sighted between the two, walked the line, and stood exactly where the line said to stand. The retaining wall was on my side of it, not by an inch, by enough that no reasonable person could call it a rounding error. I was still crouched next to that second pin, taking a photograph with my phone, when I heard tires on the gravel behind me. A white SUV, spotless, the kind that gets washed on a schedule rather than when it needs it, rolled up and stopped so close to the back of my truck that leaving would have required somebody to move first. The door opened. A woman got out, and she did not ask me my name, and she did not ask what I was photographing, and she did not say good morning. She looked at my boots, then at my truck, then at my face, in that order, and I have been alive long enough to know what that order means. Her first words to me were not a question so much as a verdict. "What exactly are you doing on our property?" Victoria Carrington was 52 years old, and she had been president of the Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association for 3 consecutive terms. I learned all of that later, but I could have guessed most of it standing there. She lived in the largest house in the community, a stone and stucco place on the highest lot with a view down the whole length of the water, and her husband had spent 30 years in commercial finance before he retired into golf and silence. Her hair was done, her linen was pressed at 8 in the morning, and her sunglasses cost more than the tires on my truck. She held her phone the way some people hold a gavel. Everything about her said that she was accustomed to being the one who decided how a conversation would go. I straightened up slowly, brushed the mud off my palms, and told her I was checking a drainage line after the storm. That was true. It was also, I thought at the time, the kind of answer that ends a conversation, because grown people generally accept that somebody looking at a culvert is looking at a culvert. She did not accept it. She tilted her head slightly, looked past me at the water, and asked which company had sent me out, not who I worked for, which company had sent me. There was an assumption buried in the grammar, and she did not bother to disguise it because in her mind it was not an assumption at all. It was simply the obvious explanation for a man dressed like me standing near water that expensive. "Nobody sent me," I said. I told her, calmly, that I had every right to be standing where I was standing. That is when she laughed. It was a short laugh, more air than sound, the kind of laugh people use as a door. She said she had lived in Silver Pines for 14 years, that she had been on the board for 8 of them, and that she knew precisely who belonged in this community and who did not. She said she had never once seen my face at a meeting, a social, or a gate. I gave her my name at that point, plainly first and last, and she did not use it. Not then, and not for another 20 minutes. She kept calling me the worker. "Look, worker, I don't know what you think you're doing down here." Every time she said it a little louder, the way people do when they are performing for an audience that has not arrived yet. She told me the shoreline path was maintained by the association, that the dock was association property, that the wall had been a board decision, and that none of it was any concern of mine. She told me she had personally approved the improvements. She was proud of that wall. And then she said the sentence that I have repeated to myself more times than I would like to admit because it was so perfectly, unself-consciously honest. A pair of boots and a pickup truck do not make you a landowner in Silver Pines. I could have ended it right there. I had a certified copy of the deed folded in the file box 8 feet behind me, and I had the survey in my hand, and 1 minute of paper would have flattened her. I did not do it. Partly because I have learned that people who are certain rarely change their minds when you hand them evidence, and partly, I will admit, because I wanted to hear how far she would take it, so I asked her a question instead. I asked whether she had ever actually read the original lake easement, the recorded one, the document that gave Silver Pines residents their access in the first place. Her face went blank for about half a second, and in that half second I learned everything I needed to know. She did not know what the easement was. She recovered fast, the way practiced people do, and told me that the association owned the lake, full stop, that it had always owned the lake, that this was common knowledge, and that she was not going to stand in the mud debating property law with a contractor. I told her that was unfortunate, because the easement was the entire legal basis for everything her community did out on that water. She said I clearly had no idea who she was. I said that was probably true, and that she had no idea who I was either, and that only one of us seemed bothered by the gap. Then she took her phone out of her jacket pocket and held it up like a warrant. "Fine," she said, "we'll let the police explain it to you." What she said into that phone was a small work of art, and I mean that with no admiration at all. She did not say a man is inspecting a culvert. She said there was an unidentified male on the lakefront, that he had no authorization to be there, that she had asked him repeatedly to leave, and that he was refusing to comply. She used the word refusing 3 separate times. She mentioned that she was the president of the Homeowners Association before she mentioned the address. She did not describe what I was doing because what I was doing was boring, and boring does not bring a patrol car quickly. She described a situation instead, and she left the outline vague enough for the imagination to fill in. Then she hung up, crossed her arms, and told me the officers were on their way. The cruiser came down the service road about 11 minutes later, which is fast for that part of the county. 2 officers got out. Officer Grant Ellison was the older one, maybe 50, thick through the shoulders, with the unhurried walk of a man who has been to 900 of these calls and found something worth arresting at maybe 12 of them. Officer Marissa Keene was younger, with her notebook already out, and she was the one who actually looked at the ground, the rock, the wall, and the tracks before she looked at either of us. Victoria intercepted them before they had fully cleared their doors. She got there first on purpose. She had figured out correctly that whoever speaks first owns the frame. She introduced herself by title before she gave her name. "I'm the president of the Silver Pines Homeowners Association," she said, and then, almost as an afterthought, Victoria Carrington. She laid it out crisply, in order the way you would present slides. The lake was private community property. I was not a resident and had never been a resident. I had been out here photographing and probing around the shoreline with a spade, without permission and without any license she was aware of. She had politely asked me to leave. I had declined. She wanted me removed, and she wanted it documented because the association had experienced, quote, security concerns. I noticed she never once said what I had damaged because I had not damaged anything. Officer Ellison turned to me and asked, without any edge in it, whether I had identification. I said yes, that it was in my wallet in my back pocket, and that I was going to reach for it with my right hand. Then I did exactly that, slowly, and handed him my driver's license, and I kept my other hand visible on my knee the whole time. He read it, glanced at my face, and read it again. Behind him, Victoria had adopted a particular expression that I would describe as patient triumph. She had done her part. The system was arriving to confirm her. Officer Keene asked me what I was doing out here at the water, and I gave her the shortest true answer available. Because this is my land. Victoria laughed out loud, not a chuckle, a real one, delivered directly into the space between 2 police officers, and she followed it with a line she clearly thought was devastating. So he simply decided this morning that he owns the entire lake. She said it to them, not to me, inviting them into the joke. Neither one of them laughed. Officer Keene wrote something down. Officer Ellison handed my license back and asked, in the tone of a man who has decided to do this properly, whether I could tell him what parcel I was referring to. I pulled up the county assessor page on my phone, read him the parcel number off the top of the page, and asked whether he could check it against the recorder system from his vehicle. "You don't need to check anything," Victoria said, and she said it loudly, in the direction of the cruiser. "The association owns it. This is a waste of your morning." Officer Ellison stopped walking and looked at her for a full 3 seconds before he answered, and something in the temperature of the conversation changed right there. "Ma'am," he said, "if there's a dispute about who owns the ground we're standing on, then checking is exactly what I need to do." He went to the passenger side of the cruiser, leaned in, and typed for a long few minutes while she filled the silence with the association's 22-year history and its annual amenity assessment. Then he straightened up with his brow pulled down and called across the gravel, "Sir, can you say your name for me one more time?" "Darius Holloway," I said. He turned the laptop screen slightly toward himself, the way you do when you want to read something a second time before you say it out loud. The parcel record was on it. The number matched what I had, 38.2. A legal description that ran on long enough to make anybody's eyes swim, full of bearings and distances and calls to the water's edge, and at the top of it, in a field labeled with the plainest word in the entire document, Darius Holloway. He read the whole thing before he spoke again, and when he did speak, it was not to me. The air out there changed completely. Officer Keene's pen stopped. Victoria came around the front of her SUV and walked toward the cruiser with her hand already out, as if the screen were a report she was entitled to review, and Officer Ellison angled the laptop just enough to make it clear she was not going to be reviewing anything. She read what she could of it anyway. Then she started talking faster, and the pitch of her voice moved up about a step and a half. She said the record was fine, that of course I owned something, that everybody knew there was an old tract adjacent to the community, that this only proved I owned the property next door and not the lakefront where we were currently standing. "Then where exactly are we standing?" Officer Keene asked. That was the whole question, and I want to give her credit for asking it that simply. I went to the file box behind my seat, took out the survey, and unfolded it on the hood of my truck so all 4 of us could see it. It is a real survey, sealed and signed, with the pin locations shown and the water line called out, and it is not a document you can argue with by raising your voice. I put my finger on the pin near the pump house, then walked the officers to that pin and let them see the iron and the orange cap sticking out of the dirt. Then I walked them 50 feet down the slope to the second pin, silt still packed around the base of it from the storm, and I showed them how the line ran between the two. Then I pointed at the ground under Victoria's expensive shoes. "Right here," I said, "about 12 feet inside my property." She did not concede a single inch. I have thought about that a great deal since, because it would have been so easy and so much cheaper to say something like there has clearly been a misunderstanding. Instead, she pivoted, instantly and smoothly, to a second position. "Fine," she said, "perhaps the strip along the bank belonged to me on paper, some leftover sliver, but the lake itself was association property, and the dock was association property, and the wall was an association improvement, and none of that was in question." She spoke as though volume were the same thing as evidence. So I opened the deed to its second page and I read the legal description out loud, slowly, the way my attorney had once read it to me. The description did not stop at the top of the bank. It took in the shoreline maintenance strip, the graded service road, and the bed of the lake itself out to the boundaries shown on the recorded plat. And then came the part that mattered more than everything else combined, the clause that had made my attorney tell me to read it twice. The instrument acknowledged a prior recorded easement in favor of the Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association, a recreational easement, access, pedestrian use, non-motorized watercraft, and one dock at a described location subject to conditions. Rights of use, nothing whatsoever about ownership and nothing at all authorizing new construction. Officer Ellison closed his laptop. He explained, in the careful language officers use when they want to be quoted accurately later, that the police do not adjudicate real property disputes, that boundary and easement questions get resolved in civil court and not on a gravel road at 9 in the morning, and that both parties should expect to involve attorneys. Then he said the other part: there was no basis on which he could cite or remove me for trespassing on a parcel recorded in my own name. Whatever else was in dispute, that particular question was answered. He recommended in the flattest possible voice that everyone go home. Officer Keene gave me a card and told me to call if I needed a copy of the incident report. The cruiser backed down the service road and turned out toward the entry gate. I folded the deed along its old creases, slid it into the plastic sleeve, and looked at her across the hood of my truck, and she was still standing there waiting for me to gloat so she could have something to be offended about. I did not give her that. "Now," I said, "we can talk about the dock you built on my property." For the first time since her tires stopped on the gravel, Victoria Carrington had nothing to say. She told me the deed was obviously in error, and that 2 decades of practice counted for something. So I told her the history, standing right there, because she had never once been curious enough to learn it. The lake was dug as an irrigation reservoir on a family farm long before anybody drew a subdivision plat. When the developer assembled the land for Silver Pines, they bought the outer acreage, and they tried very hard to buy the core parcel, the one holding the water. The family would not sell. So the lawyers built a workaround, and the workaround was the easement, and the easement is the only reason anybody in Silver Pines has ever legally set foot on that shoreline. It gave residents access, it gave them a path, a launch, and a dock. It gave them nothing else, and it did not need to, because access was all the brochures required. Victoria did not create that fiction, she inherited it, but she is the one who put it in bold. Under her presidency, the association's materials described Lake Bellweather as a privately owned community asset. The annual assessment carried a separate amenity charge tied to the lake, collected from every one of the roughly 200 households in Silver Pines. She had a lakefront improvement plan with a name and a budget. She had approved the wall, and she had approved the dock expansion, and she had done it with the confidence of a woman who believed the ground under the project was hers to develop. Confidence is not a defect. Building on somebody else's dirt is. I walked her along the wall and showed her where the line ran, pin to pin, with the survey open in my hand so she could follow it. She looked at the block and she looked at the pin, and I watched her do the same arithmetic I had done an hour earlier. Then I pointed down at the dock where the new framing carried the platform out past the old footprint into water that the plat put squarely inside my boundary. I said I would need a licensed surveyor to fix exact numbers, but that I could see it from where we stood, and so could she. That is when the threats started, and they came out in a very particular order. The association had counsel on retainer. The association had reserves and could fund litigation for years. The association had a membership of nearly 200 families who would not appreciate being dragged into a lawsuit by an outsider, and juries, she said, care about communities. She told me to think very carefully about the kind of fight I was starting and about how it would feel to have every household in Silver Pines against me. She was not describing the law to me. She was describing leverage. And underneath all of it was the same assumption that had produced the phone call, which was that a man like me would eventually be frightened by a woman like her. "I am not starting a fight with Silver Pines," I told her. "I am asking you to stop building on my land." She said the survey would not show what I thought it would show. I told her a licensed surveyor would be out at 8 the next morning, that he would set stakes, that she and the association's property manager were welcome to observe, and that I would send the report to the board regardless of what it said. She lifted her chin and told me I would not like what that survey found. I did not answer her. I got in my truck, backed up around the SUV she still had not moved, and drove out past the gate, thinking one thing very clearly. She was the one who should be worried. Colin Beckett arrived the next morning at 7:50, which is the kind of thing that makes a man worth his fee. He is a licensed surveyor I have used on commercial jobs for 11 years, a lean and unhurried man who wears a straw hat in July and talks to his equipment more than he talks to clients. He brought a helper, a total station, a bundle of wooden stakes, and a sack of orange plastic caps. I told him what I needed, which was every boundary point along the water fixed and marked, and every association structure located relative to that boundary. He nodded, said it would take most of the day, and went to find the first pin. He set the third stake behind the retaining wall, on the upland side, and he set it in a place that took the argument off the table permanently. The block wall was inside my line, not marginally. He wrote the offset in his book, read it back to his helper, where he spent longer, because water complicates everything. When he finally set a stake and shot the far corner of the new platform, he straightened up and said the number out loud. The dock extension crossed my boundary by nearly 16 feet. Victoria took her sunglasses off. I remember that detail because it was the first genuinely involuntary thing I saw her do. Then Colin looked up the shoreline to the east, at the little pavilion the association had built for its summer socials, and asked me whether I wanted that located too. I said yes. It took him 40 minutes. It is a modest structure, open-sided, with a shingled roof, 6 posts, a concrete pad, and a plaque with a former board member's name on it. When Colin was done, he called me over and showed me the sketch. The east corner of the pavilion, including one post and a wedge of the slab, sat past the boundary and onto my parcel. Small, undeniable, documented with a seal on it. He delivered it in 4 days. My attorney and I sent the association a package that same week, addressed to the board rather than to Victoria personally, with a copy to the property manager and a copy to the registered agent. It contained a certified copy of the deed, a certified copy of the recorded recreational easement, the sealed survey with the encroachment exhibit, and a formal notice of encroachment. The notice made 4 requests: immediately suspend all construction and grading within the described boundary. Provide copies of every permit issued for the wall, the dock expansion, and the pavilion. Identify the legal authority under which the association had constructed permanent improvements on the parcel. Preserve all related records and correspondence. Victoria called me 2 days later, and her tone had changed so much that it took me a second to place her voice. She was warm. She called me Darius, which she had managed to avoid entirely on the day we met. She said there was no reason for any of this to become adversarial, that reasonable people resolved these things privately, and that she was sure we could reach an understanding that respected the community's long-standing use. Then, about 90 seconds in, the warmth thinned out, and the real sentence came through. She said I was exploiting a technicality. She said it twice. A technicality that any court would see for what it was. "When you called the police," I said, "you called it ownership. Now that the paper is not on your side, it is a technicality." She hung up on me, and the following afternoon, before I had even finished writing up a bid on a warehouse pad in the next county, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and it was the County Land Development Office. The woman on the line was polite and thorough, and she had my survey exhibit in front of her, because my attorney had copied it to them as a matter of routine. She did not want to talk about the dock, or not primarily. What she wanted to know, and she asked it more than once, was who had approved a retaining wall built directly against the lake's outlet and drainage structure. The county's findings came back over the next 3 weeks, and I want to be careful not to inflate them, because the truth was serious enough. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was charged with a crime. What the county found was that the lakefront improvement work had proceeded without required permits, that the segmental wall sat within a regulated drainage area without engineering review, that the dock expansion had been built without any submittal at all, and that the association had at no point demonstrated the property interest necessary to authorize permanent construction at that location. They issued a stop work determination and directed that the extended portion of the dock be closed to use pending inspection. Orange fencing went up around the far end of the dock on a Thursday. That is the part everyone in Silver Pines actually saw. A private community with its own gate and its own monument sign suddenly had county tape on its waterfront in the middle of swimming season, and by Friday evening every household in the neighborhood was asking the same question in the same words. What happened to the lake? Victoria answered that question first, and she answered it the way she had answered everything else, by getting to the frame before anyone else could. Her message to the membership said that an outside landowner had asserted a claim to portions of Lake Bellweather and was attempting to interfere with community amenities, that the board was defending residents' rights vigorously, and that legal counsel had been engaged. She did not mention the missing permits. She did not mention the easement. She did not mention that the outside landowner had been standing on his own property when she called the police on him. She made me a threat because a threat unifies people, and unity was the only thing that could keep her in that chair. It nearly worked, and then on a Tuesday evening, a car I did not recognize came up my driveway, and a man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead got out and introduced himself as Thomas Avery. He said he had served on the Silver Pines board for 2 years, that he sat on the finance committee, and that he had a very specific problem. The president had told the membership that the association owned the lake outright. Thomas had gone looking for the document that proved it, and he could not find one anywhere. I brought him inside and put the whole file on my kitchen table. The deed, the recorded easement, all 9 pages of it with the county stamp in the corner, Collins' survey with the encroachment exhibit, the county correspondence. Thomas read for the better part of an hour without saying much, and I let him because paper works best on people when nobody is talking over it. When he finally sat back, the first thing he said was that he had assumed I was trying to take the lake away from the community. The second thing he said was that he now understood that residents' access had never been at risk at all, because the easement was permanent and it had never depended on the association owning anything. That is the whole point, I told him. Nobody is losing the lake. The association built structures beyond what the easement allows, on land it does not own without permits. That is the entire dispute. Then Thomas asked the question that turned this from a property matter into something closer to accountability. He asked whether Victoria had known. I got up, went to my office, and printed an email. My attorney had sent it 6 months before the morning she called the police, back when I first heard through a contractor friend that the association was soliciting bids for lakefront improvement work. It was 2 paragraphs long, professional to the point of dullness, and it did exactly one thing. It informed the association that the parcel boundary in the vicinity of Lake Bellweather was documented and that the association should confirm the boundary and the scope of its recorded easement with the owner in writing before commencing any construction. It offered to provide the survey on request. It listed a phone number and an email address. It had been sent to the association's official address and to Victoria Carrington directly by name at the address printed on the association's own letterhead. There was a delivery confirmation. There was never a reply. Not a call, not an email, not an acknowledgement. She had been warned in writing, half a year before the first truckload of rock came down that service road, and she had chosen to treat the warning as beneath her attention. That is the part that took the whole thing out of the category of honest mistake for me. It was not that she did not know. It was that she had decided the question was not worth her time, and then when the owner turned up in work boots at the water's edge, she called the police on him. Thomas read the email twice. He set it down on the table very carefully, squared the edges with his fingers, and looked at me for a long moment. "There's a board meeting tomorrow night," he said. "You should be there." "Does Victoria know I've been invited?" "Not yet." The clubhouse meeting room at Silver Pines Estates holds maybe 60 people in folding chairs, and on an ordinary month a dozen show up, mostly to complain about parking or the pool hours. That night there were people standing along the back wall and out into the hallway. Word about the county fencing had traveled, and the amenity assessment had just gone out, and nothing brings out a membership faster than a bill and a rumor arriving in the same week. Victoria sat at the head of the long table with a leather portfolio in front of her and a printed agenda squared to the table edge. She looked entirely in command right up until the moment I walked through the door. I watched her face reorganize itself in real time. She stood before I had found a chair and announced that the meeting was open to members only, that I was not a member of the association, and that I had no standing to attend, let alone speak. Thomas Avery said without standing up that the board had invited me in my capacity as the owner of the parcel under discussion, that the invitation had been extended in accordance with the bylaws governing interested parties, and that he was prepared to move for a vote on it if the president preferred to do this the long way. 2 other board members said they had no objection. Victoria sat back down. I did not shout at that woman. I did not insult her, and I did not use the meeting to make a speech about how her morning had made me feel, because I have learned that a raised voice gives your opponent something to point at. What I did instead was open my folder and place 5 documents on the table, one at a time, and name each one as it went down. A certified copy of the deed, a certified copy of the recorded recreational easement, Colin Beckett's sealed survey with the encroachment exhibit, the county's stop work determination and findings, and the email my attorney had sent to Victoria Carrington 6 months before any construction began. Copies went down the table. The room got very quiet, in the way rooms do when people are reading instead of listening. I walked them through it in the plainest language I had. Here is the parcel, and here is who owns it. Here is what the easement grants the community, which is access, walking, non-motorized boating. Here is what it does not grant, which is any ownership interest and any right to build. Here is where the wall sits relative to the line. Here is the dock, 16 feet over. Here is the corner of the pavilion. Here is the county telling you that none of it was permitted. Then I told them about the phone call. I did not decorate it. I said that on the morning in question I had been on my own parcel, checking my own drainage after the storm, when Mrs. Carrington pulled in behind my truck and asked what I was doing on her property. I said she asked which company had sent me. I said she called me the worker repeatedly after I had given her my name. I quoted her exactly because the exact words were more than sufficient. A pair of boots and a pickup truck do not make you a landowner in Silver Pines. And I said that when I told her I had a right to stand there, she dialed 911 and described me as an unidentified male refusing to leave. Mrs. Carrington saw a black man in work clothes standing next to the water, I said, and decided the one thing I could not possibly be was the man who owned it. She denied it immediately and forcefully. She said the suggestion was outrageous, that race had nothing to do with anything, that she would have called about any unidentified person near the lakefront, and that she resented the implication in the strongest terms. I did not argue with her about what was in her heart. That is an argument nobody wins, and I had no need of it. I simply asked the board to obtain the incident report, which is a public record, and read it. The report reflects who initiated the call, what she alleged, and how the officers resolved it, which was by confirming that the parcel was recorded in my name and that there was no basis for a trespass charge. She said she had received a great deal of correspondence. She said she could not be expected to personally track every letter from every attorney. Thomas asked whether she had forwarded it to anyone at all. She said she did not recall. The room made a sound I do not have a good word for, somewhere between a murmur and an exhale, and I have thought since that it was the sound of 100 people revising their opinion of somebody simultaneously. Thomas moved that the president's authority to approve lakefront projects without full board review be suspended pending an independent audit of all amenity construction going back 5 years. The motion carried without much difficulty at all. Then a man in the back row who had not said a word all evening raised his hand and asked me the question everyone had been circling for 2 hours. "Mr. Holloway, what is it that you actually want?" "Nothing dramatic," I said. "I want the association to honor the agreement it signed." Then I listed it, because vague grievances get negotiated and specific terms get executed. The association reimburses the survey cost and my documented legal fees, which together came to less than the price of the wall they built. The misplaced retaining wall gets rebuilt behind the boundary, to engineered plans with the required permits. The encroaching section of the dock gets shortened or relocated so that the structure sits within the easement's described location. The pavilion corner gets resolved by a recorded agreement rather than demolition, because tearing down a memorial for one post and a wedge of slab would be spite dressed up as principle. Any future construction touching my parcel requires my written consent under the easement terms. And the last item mattered to me more than the money did. The association corrects its own documents, the newsletters, the amenity descriptions, the welcome packet given to every buyer, the language on the assessment invoice. No document produced by Silver Pines Estates would state or imply that the association owned Lake Bellweather, because it never had, and because 22 years of repeating a comfortable error is how a community ends up with county tape on its dock in July. In exchange, every resident keeps the access the easement grants them, permanently, exactly as written, and I would put that in writing too. You could feel the fight leave the room. Victoria's entire case with her neighbors had rested on my being a predator, and I had just declined the role in front of all of them. The board voted to authorize negotiation of a settlement along those lines, and it was not close. Then Thomas asked for the floor one more time and made a second motion, this one concerning the office of the president, citing the ignored notice, the unreported correspondence, the unpermitted construction, and the police call. There was a discussion I did not participate in. When the hands went up, Victoria Carrington no longer had a majority behind her, and by the end of the week she had resigned rather than sit through the rest of it. She stopped beside me on her way out of the clubhouse. Her portfolio was under her arm and her chin was still up, and she looked at me the way you look at weather that has ruined a plan. "You must be very pleased with yourself," she said. "I never needed you to lose," I told her. "I only needed you to stop deciding who I was before you learned my name." She did not answer that. She went out through the double doors into the parking lot, and I gathered up my documents, and that was the last conversation the two of us ever had. 7 weeks later, I drove down my service road on a Saturday morning with a thermos on the seat beside me and nothing on my schedule. The wall had been rebuilt where it belonged, properly engineered this time, permitted, and honestly better looking than the original. The dock had been shortened and reconfigured to sit inside the described location, and the county fencing was long gone. There was a recorded consent agreement on file covering the pavilion corner, signed by me and by a new board president. Colin's orange-capped stakes had been replaced by permanent boundary markers, set flush, the kind that do not move and do not require anybody's memory to stay accurate. I parked in the same flat spot by the old pump house, on the same gravel where a white SUV once blocked me in, and I got out in the same steel toe boots and the same faded canvas shirt. Nothing about me had changed at all. That was the part I kept turning over as I stood there with my coffee. Not one thing about who I was, what I owned, or what I was entitled to do on that ground had been different on the morning she called the police. The only thing that had changed was what other people had been willing to check before they decided. Thomas Avery came along the shoreline path with a coffee of his own and lifted a hand and said, "Morning, Darius," and we talked for about 10 minutes about a culvert on the north end that he was worried about and about his daughter's move to Denver. 2 women walked past with a stroller and a beagle and nodded at me, and one of them said good morning, and neither of them asked what I was doing there. That is the whole difference. Nobody stops me anymore to ask what right I have to stand at the edge of a lake that has my name on the paperwork. A man in worn boots driving a high-mileage truck may be exactly what he appears to be, or he may hold the deed to the ground you are standing on, and you cannot tell from the outside, which is the entire point. A title, a term of office, or 14 years of living on the highest lot does not sit above a recorded instrument, and contempt is not just kind. It is expensive because it makes you stop asking questions right at the moment when a single question would have saved you. I never had to raise my voice to say that the lake belonged to me. Victoria Carrington called the police to prove I did not belong there. In the end, all I had to do was stand still and let one piece of paper with the name Darius Holloway on it speak for me.